Hello, everybody. This is Rachna, and I'm here with active and passive voice for you. So, let's get started on active and passive voice. Well, children, you see, uh, there is a lot to say about active and passive voice, and you see, it is a grammatical voice commonly used in many of the languages across the world. It is the unmarked voice for clauses featuring a transitive verb in nominative accusative languages, which includes English and a few other European languages as well. So you see, when the subject of a sentence performs the verb's action, we say that the sentence is in the active voice, right? And sentences in the active voice have a strong, direct, and clear tone. And what happens in the case of a passive voice? A passive voice is in the passive voice when the subject is acted on by the verb. So, the passive voice is always constructed with a conjugated form of to be plus the verb's past participle, right? So let's understand how to before we understand how to change to a passive voice and so on and so forth, but let's understand the rules that we use for present simple tense in the case of active and passive voice. So when we have active voice, it's like subject plus verb plus s, the first form of the verb, plus s or es plus the object, right? But in the case of passive voice, understand that the auxiliary verb with is, am, or are, right? So what happens here? In the first case, it's like object plus is, am, are, plus the verbs, the third form of the verb with by and then the subject. So here, in the second case, it happens like subject plus do or does or not, that is does not, plus first form of the verb and the object. Now in the case of passive voice, it becomes like object plus is, am, or are with not and then the third form of the verb followed by the subject. Okay, then of course you have to write by under the subject. So in the case of the active voice, it happens like does plus subject plus first form of the verb and the object with of course the question mark. So that is in the case of the interrogative sentences. Then we have is, am, are plus object plus the verb, third form of the verb, plus by subject, and then of course followed by the interrogative mark, right? The mark of interrogation. So let's look at the example here. It's like active voice is like he does not cook food. And in the case of the passive voice, food is not cooked by him. So you see, it's like what happened in the passive voice is the object and not the subject first. But in the case of the active voice, is the subject first. So it's like subject is who? He, right? And in the passive voice, it's like him. Okay, so we have it as what? We have it as he does not cook food, and the passive voice becomes like food is not cooked by him. So you see, this is what is the most important thing here, children. Um, Whenever you want to make sure that whether you are doing the passive voice, understand that you have to ask who, right? You have to ask yourself, who did this? And the answer would be, whoever did it. So please understand that whenever you are changing it, you make sure that you ask a certain question, right? You'll get the answer. And like I have always maintained this fact, uh, when you are studying grammar, English grammar, please understand that the literal meaning itself is the solution to all your queries. You see, it's like when you're saying active voice. Just if we go back to the previous slide, then there is an action that is happening, right? This is active. You're actively involved in something, right? So naturally, that becomes active voice. And passive is when there is no such action going on. So what happens in the first case here? He does not cook food. There is an action, right? And in the passive case, what is it? It's like food is not cooked by him, right? So always understand that when we are doing active and passive voice, the literal meaning itself is the solution to your queries. And you know what? I'm not going to go into the details of the tenses because we have already covered tenses, and I have around three different videos for you on just tenses. All right. So if you actually go through that, I'm sure you will have you'll be able to understand this active and passive voice even better, right? So here we have what happens in the case of present continuous tense. Like I have said earlier, also continuous as the ing form to the verb, right? So keeping that in mind, in passive voice you have auxiliary verb with is, am, are plus being. So if you're adding being, you have all your queries, you have all your problems solved in the case of passive voice. So let's look at the first one. It's like subject plus is, am, are plus the first form of the verb with ing to it and the object. So when you are converting it or when you are changing it to passive, it becomes like object plus is, am, are with being plus the third form of the verb by and the subject. Now, in the case of active voice, what happens? You have is, am, are plus subject with the first form of the verb and ing with it and the object. Of course, in the case of interrogative, you have the interrogative mark, the mark of interrogation. And then if you have the if you're changing it to passive voice, it's like is, am, are plus object with the third form of the verb and by subject, right? By, of course, the subject. All right. So what happens? If we look at this example, this is an example of the mark of interrogation. It's an interrogative sentence. Is Ritika buying a table? So the passive voice of this would become, is a table being bought by Ritika? Right? So now if we look at the present perfect tense, alright, what happens here? In the case of the present perfect tense, the passive voice, if you look at it, it has the auxiliary verb which has or have plus being. Okay, now in the case of the subject, you have has, have plus the third form of the verb with the object. And here you have object plus has, have plus being along with the third form of the verb followed by and then the subject. Now if you're looking at the active voice, it's like subject plus have or has, not, this is in the case of the negative, okay, plus the third form of the verb and the object. And in the case of the passive, it's like object plus has, have, and then not, plus being, plus the third form of the verb followed by subject. Okay. Now in the case of the interrogative sentence, it is has, have plus subject plus third form of the verb with the object. Then you have, for the passive, you will make it like has, have plus object plus being followed by the third form of the verb, and then you have by subject, of course the question mark to it. So the example would be, have they left the apartment in case of the active voice, and in the case of the passive voice it becomes like has apartment been left by them. Alright, now if we look at the past simple tense, the auxiliary verb with was or were, this would be in the case of the passive voice. So what happens? It's like subject plus verb, the second form of the verb, and the object. And in the case of the passive voice, is like object plus was, were, the third form of the verb plus by and the subject. Now what happens in the second case? It's like subject plus did plus not, and then you have the first form of the verb followed by the object. Now what happens if you are changing it into passive voice negative sentence? It's like object plus was or were plus not plus the third form of the verb followed by subject. Okay, and in the case of the interrogative sentence, it becomes like did plus subject, then the first form of the verb followed by the object, not to forget the question mark. And in the case of the passive voice, it would convert like was, were followed by the object, then the third form of the verb, and then by subject. Again, do not forget the question mark. Here what happens? The example is active, I saved him. In the case of passive, it is he was saved by me, right? So now what happens in the past continuous tense? It's like auxiliary verb was, were plus being in the case of passive voice. So active voice would be like subject with was or were with the followed by the first form of the verb, of course not to forget the ing to this as it's a continuous tense, and then the object. Here in the case of passive voice, object comes first, right? So it's like object plus was, were plus being with the third form of the verb by plus the subject. Here it's like, in the case of the negative sentence, it is like subject with was, were followed by not the and then the first form of the verb having the auxiliary ing to it, and then the object. Okay, here in the case of the passive voice, it becomes like object with was, were, then not, and then the being plus third form of the verb followed by subject. In the case of the interrogative sentence for active voice, it becomes like was verb plus subject with the first verb form with ing to it and then the object. Whereas in the case of the passive voice, it's like was verb plus object plus being plus the third form of the verb followed of course by and then the subject. And not to forget the question mark, because then it doesn't become a proper interrogative sentence. And here if we look at the examples, it's like Manish was repairing the car, and in the case of the passive voice it becomes like the car was being repaired by Manish. Alright, so what do we have for past perfect tense? Auxiliary verb had plus being in the case of passive voice. So if we look at the first form, it's like subject plus had plus verb third form and then the object. When we convert it to passive voice, it becomes like object plus had plus being and then the third form of the verb followed by and then the subject. Now, what happens in the case of the negative sentence? It's like subject plus had plus not plus the third verb form and then the object. In the case of the passive voice, it's like object plus had plus not plus being and then the third form of the verb followed by subject. Now, if we look at the interrogative sentence, it's like had plus subject plus verb third form with the object. And of course, not to forget the question mark. Here, in the case of the passive voice, when you're converting it, it becomes like had plus object plus being plus the third form of the verb and then you have the followed by the subject, by plus the subject. Now, if we look at the example, it's like active, I had paid 50,000. Now, the passive would be like 50,000 had been paid by me, right? So, let's look at the future simple tense. Well, here we have auxiliary verb will plus be. Do not forget the auxiliaries will and shall, right? So here it is like subject plus will plus the first form of the verb and then the object. In the case of passive, it becomes like object plus will plus be and then the third form of the verb followed by and then the subject. In the case of the negative sentence, it becomes like subject, will and then not followed by the first form of the verb and then the object. In the case that you are converting it to passive, it becomes like object plus will and then not to be followed by be, the third form of the verb and then by subject. Now in the case of the interrogative sentence, it becomes like will plus subject plus third form of the verb, object. And then of course not to forget the question mark. Now in the case of the passive voice, it becomes like will plus object plus be plus the third form of the verb by and then the subject. Now the example would be like Disha will not arrange the things. So here we have the things will not be arranged by Disha. Now future perfect tense. What happens here? Subject plus will and followed by have, the third form of the verb and then the object. In the case of the passive voice, it's like object first, followed by will, have, and then been, and then the third form of the verb, followed by, and then the subject. In the case of the negative sentence, it will become like subject, will, have, followed by not, the third form of the verb, and then the object. But when we take it to passive voice, it becomes like object plus will, then have, not, followed by being, the third form of the verb, and then the subject. Now, in the case of will, that is the interrogative sentence I'm telling you, will plus subject plus have, and then the third form of the word followed by the object, and not forget the question mark. In the case of the passive voice, it changes to will plus object plus have, been, then the third form of the verb followed by, and then the subject. What are the example? Sorry, what is the example? It's like they will have won the match. So when you convert it to passive voice, it becomes the match will have been won by them. Right? Now there are few things to remember, children. There are certain cases where there is no formation of passive voice. For example, in the present perfect continuous tense, past perfect continuous tense, future perfect continuous tense, and the future continuous tense. You see, it's majorly the continuous tense, the perfect continuous tenses where we do not have the passive voice. And I hope you remember that of course in the future continuous tense as well there will be no passive voice, right? So how do you identify active and passive voice? To identify the passive voice, find the verb and ask who or what performed the action. You remember in the beginning of this video I was telling you that if you want to find out, easily know how to identify the passive voice, you just ask yourself a question, who, right? So if the who or what that performed the action is at the beginning of the sentence is an active voice. Like if you notice that all these rules which I have been telling you until now, in the case that you have the subject in the beginning, then it is in the active voice. But if it is not in the beginning, then it is in the passive voice. And then you must look out for the word by or which, because then that is often the indication of a passive voice, right? Like if you go back to the previous slide, what do you have here? They will have won the match. Here the subject is in the beginning, hence it is the active voice, whereas in the passive they is converted into them, and then it is the action which comes first. The match will have been won by them. Alright, an action is what? It's a verb. So it's as simple as this, children. I hope I've really made it a little simple for you. I know most of you do not like the rules and so on and so forth. But children, if you just understand this part, how to identify the active and the passive voice, you will have done your bit. And trust me, you would never have a problem after that. Okay, so how to change the active to passive voice? To change an active voice sentence to a passive voice sentence, make the object of the active sentence into the subject of the passive sentence. That is, you got to convert it. The subject goes, towards the end in the passive voice, whereas In the case of the active voice, the subject is in the beginning, like which I have been telling you, I think 3 times earlier in this same video. Yeah, use a verb to be in the same tense as the main verb of the active sentence. All right, and then use the past participle of the main verb of the active sentence. All right, so you would be able to change it from active to passive voice. Well, I hope you enjoy learning English and thank you so very much. Children, just go through it, but go through it with a very, very cool head. And if you have any queries, do let me know in the classroom, right? Well, take very good care of yourself. Bye bye.